It's a pleasure to be in this conversation about your very interesting new book, Shut Down: How COVID Shook the World's Economy. In your book, you use the term Anthropocene as this moment at which humanity is responsible for the fundamental shift in our relationship to nature, a concept related to climate change and biodiversity that can be used for the COVID crisis. Are we living the first global crisis of the Anthropocene?
I do believe we are. And I must say that for me, it came as a shock to grasp that. I, like many people, and I imagine perhaps many people on this call, was very preoccupied at the beginning of 2020 with what I took to be the central and most urgent environmental crisis facing us, which was climate. And I was in fact writing a book about the political economy of the climate crisis. And then we were blindsided, as if, from the side, by the shock of a pandemic, which was moving faster than the chronology of the climate crisis, that made us into each other's danger. So we were literally body to body each other's danger. And by way of that, also had the capacity to potentially hurt the entirety of humanity, all 7.8 billion of us, in a short period of time. And that is awesome in its scale. The measures that we took to counter it were very large by any historic standard. It's an unprecedented economic shock. They are large even by the most extreme scenarios calculated by the climate modelers. And if you look back, and this is what really shook me as a historian and intellectually shook me, if you look back over the period in which we have progressively realized and come to awareness about the climate crisis, which is a period of about 50 years since the early 1970s, when the models started being done and the measurements started being made and the basic diagnosis has crystallized, over that same period, another group of scientists were developing the diagnosis of the emerging infectious diseases paradigm, which touched on very similar issues to do with the imbalance between human society and nature, that was thinking about the risks that might originate, for instance, in our laboratories and the ways in which we there hubristically try and manipulate nature, and was saying, if you add all that together, plus the fact that we fly around the world in airplanes all the time, it will be very lucky if we do not face a series of escalating biological risks. And in a sense, what happened in 2020 is really just the fulfillment of that prediction. And if you look back to swine flu in 2008-9, if you look back to the avian flu scare of the early 2000s, if you look back to SARS, if you had been focused on this and been willing to give it the dignity, the status, the significance of that we have finally recognized the climate problem as being, nothing about what happened would have been surprising. So that for me is the motive. That's why I want to say this, is that I think those of us who have previously been thinking about climate need to add this to our portfolio and to our understanding of time, our understanding of history and the sort of risks that we're exposed to.
As you clearly explained, the pandemic and the lockdown caused the biggest drop in economic activity in history, even deeper than in 1929 or in 2008. The consequences were not so catastrophic as feared because governments and central banks acted in an unorthodox way. This fusion of fiscal and monetary activism. Is this the end of the economic orthodoxy? Is this the new liberal dogma over? Is Keynes back?
Well, I think at the level of ideology, at the level of dogma, at the level of orthodoxy, yes. I think it's very difficult in the face of this to maintain any of those as solid structures of thought. But if you ask about power, if you ask about how we govern, if you recognize how ambiguous neoliberal governance has always been, on the one hand, if you recognize how neoliberalism was also a social project, a project of class demobilization on the one hand and mobilization on the other. It was a regime of making a politics of a certain sort of inequality bearable. You would have to say there is a very profound level of continuity. And one of the warnings of the book is to say, sure, there's a doctrinal breakthrough. Sure, there are very expansive monetary and fiscal policies being deployed. But do not be confused. Do not imagine that we are in a time capsule. And if you're British or American, you can travel back to the age of the great Labour government of 45, to Attlee, or to the period of the New Deal, or in Germany to the age of corporatism in the 60s and 70s. Those days are gone. They have been changed radically by history. And so those same policies, which may look Keynesian, are now being deployed in ways which are in many ways profoundly conservative, and they stabilize a social system forever transformed by the neoliberal shock, one of profound inequality. And to make matters even worse, if there is one dimension along which we can mark possibly a fundamental rupture, it's in the dimension of geopolitics, which was also always part of the neoliberal project, because another way of reading neoliberalism was not that it was Austrian economics or that it was Milton Friedman, but it was an American power project. It was a way of anchoring the Washington consensus. And that may be one element which is fundamentally broken, but that doesn't open to an emancipatory high horizon of internationalism and revived social democracy. That opens to a horizon of renewed Cold War, and in the American case, really massive commitments to hard power, to a whole new generation, as I was arguing in a recent article in the New Statesman, a whole new generation of weaponry with global implications, and a rupture within what we took globalization to be.
And did this management of the crisis relatively succeeded because we learned from the mistakes of the 2008 crisis?
Yes. I think that's, as it were, one of the optimistic lessons here, is that we do learn, and for that reason also to an extent history is worth doing, by which I mean, as it were, running commentary, analysis, attempts to situate, to evaluate, and I don't claim any particular privilege on the part of myself or historians. This has gone on, and we can tell because it's actually making real impact in the finance ministry in Berlin, in the ECB, in the Fed, in the people who advise the centrists in Congress, the Chuck Schumers, the Nancy Pelosi's of this world. These are people who have spent the last 12 years rapidly digesting the consequences of those earlier, what they regard as policy mistakes, and have adjusted. And I would point to three places that really matter. One is more remote from Spain, which is the Fed. But the scale of the Fed's actions in March is extraordinary historically. It's much larger than the ECB did. It's larger than any central bank has ever done. And the people who did that are literally veterans of 2008. So they know how to buy treasuries at a speed which is just extraordinary. $1 million a second, 70, $80 billion a day for several weeks, extraordinary. In the ECB, we've seen really minds changed. So the ECB, I don't need to tell the Spanish audience, in 2010, 2011, is it's a garrote. It's one of the things tightening the blood supply of the European economy. They raise interest rates in 2011. It's inexplicable in retrospect. That isn't going to happen with the current team. And what's really striking and interesting about it is it's because it's the ECB, a multinational team. So we have a French president, we have an Irish chief economist, and we have Isabel Schnabel, who's German. And she has been very much part of this process of lesson learning. And that's vital for Europe's future. And the other place where we've seen, I know because I know the people, but you can also see it publicly, real concrete learning is in the team around the German finance minister Olaf Scholz, who's now obviously the lead candidate in the German election. And in a quiet way, these are not radicals, Scholz in particular is no radical, but in a quiet way, they have digested the disaster that was Germany's policy stance during the Eurozone. And their initial policy was just to be quiet, not to exacerbate. This is what we saw in 2019 around Italy, 2018, 2019. And then they moved on to the front foot. And it was between the finance ministry in Berlin and in Paris that the deal was done that opened the door to Next Gen EU. And that is absolutely explicit learning. They could see by April once the Corona bond proposal was shot down with contempt. I mean, this was a terrible moment for Europe that they had to dig out. So Europe came very close to repeating disaster and steered away.
You say that the economic response to this crisis has not been a revolution, but the result, partially improvised, of technocratic governance. Do we need to rethink global economic governance?
Oh, it will be nice. Surely we should. If your commitment is to democracy, if your commitment is to equality, that must be your normative position. The question is how to do it and with what political force and what coalition you can mobilize. And the great moments of transition in that respect reflect powerful underlying social forces. This is true of the emergence of the Keynesian welfare state in the 1930s and 1940s. It's true of the neoliberal moment as well, that underlying forces shift. And my skepticism is that anything like that has happened in this moment. If anything, the crisis has compounded the inequalities that exist and compounded the demobilization. And it's not for nothing that, Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn have disappeared from the scene. That doesn't mean that things can't happen. So what I'm trying to describe is a dialectic in a sense. It's a subsumption. It's an infusion. And we can see it in terms of personnel. I mean, a lot of the people making economic policy around Biden are actually from the Sanders campaign. And they deliberately incorporated them into so the argument going on, the folks on the call may be following this incredible debate going on in Washington, D.C. right now about $3.5 trillion. That's the Sanders people pushing that within the Biden camp. But that is, in a sense, a technocratic politics. That's not a politics of the street. It's not a politics of electoral mobilization. It's an inside working of trying to shift the terms of the political argument and the technocratic argument. That's not what one normatively would desire, but it is what is available at this moment as a way of making progress.
And there is an unexpected hero in your narrative, Powell, the chief of the Federal Reserve, chosen by Trump. His management of the crisis prevented the collapse of the markets, especially the treasury bonds, and it also helped the emerging countries to maintain some stability. At the same time, the ECB followed Mario Draghi's famous strategy, whatever it takes. Yeah. Were we on the edge of the abyss at the beginning of this crisis?
Yes, we were. I mean, and one of the missions of the book is to put that across. I mean, I hope the book will be useful because it's a global overview, because it brings a lot of things together. It links economics and politics and geopolitics. But if there's something that for many readers will be new, it is the realization of just how serious the financial crisis was in the United States. And because it's in the United States, it affects the whole world in the second and third week of March. And at that moment, we saw something even more shocking than what we saw in 2008. The 2008 crisis, and again, one hardly needs to tell people in Spain, was a private sector crisis driven by a real estate boom that bust, that then spiraled into the banking system. Government debt in reasonable places, not managed by the ECB under Jean-Claude Trichet, was a safe place to go under those circumstances. This is what we saw in the United States. In Europe, they managed to destabilize government debt as well, which is why we were in the doom loop that Spain was in by the summer of 2012. What we saw in 2020 was that doom loop playing out, not in Spain, with all due respect, a large but not central economy to the global system, but in the United States. In 2020, we saw in second and third week of March, we saw US Treasury prices falling as panic broke out in the private sector. So people were selling treasuries as well as private equity. And that is not something you want to see in a panic. And the second thing we saw, even more terrifying, was that you couldn't sell treasuries, large batches, $2 to $3 billion quickly. You could probably find a price, but the fact that you had to haggle is terrifying. And this is crucial to understand because when we say the dollar is the global hegemonic currency, we use these kind of formulas. It isn't the ugly green American banknotes. I mean, they're the trashiest, nastiest money in the world. It is treasuries, US treasuries, government debt. And there are about 21 trillion of them, dollars worth, held by private investors. And that is the anchor of the global financial system. And that market is so important to investors because it's so big that you can rationally assume that whatever your private problem is that drives you to sell US Treasuries, it won't be big enough to destabilize the home market. So you can have your private panic, and in that market, you can just take whatever the price is that day. And in terms of calculating portfolios, this is crucial because it means you can calculate a big part of your portfolio as giving you interest, but also essentially just being the same as cash, because you can flip it into cash at whatever the price is on that day. And that assumption broke down in the second and third week of March. And when that breaks down, all the rest of the portfolio is unstable because you can only hold those less liquid, higher returning assets if you know you have a cash reserve piggy bank. And treasuries were no longer good in that way. I mean, I've spoken to investors who, describe the trauma of managing large amounts of money and discovering that the cash reserve that you hold to secure you is essentially, you look at the banknote and you realize it's not actually a banknote anymore. And that was causing panic. I mean, it was genuinely causing panic. And you can see how big the panic was by just the scale of what the Fed did. I mean, it would not have acted on the scale that it did if it had not been profoundly concerned about the stability of the entire system.
And is this monetary activism sustainable? What risks do we face when the stimulus has finished?
I mean, this, I think, is an absolutely reasonable question, but it may be a question that we can no longer afford. I mean, that, I think, is one of the more alarming implications of thinking hard about 2020. If you regard this as the beginning of the Anthropocene, then this is not the only crisis of this type that we're going to face. We've already been through several that have been profoundly disturbing. And so this question about sustainability begins to take on a rather peculiar kind of feel. I mean, you're asking, can we normalize? I'm not sure that normality is within the reach of our current situation. To reduce the need for central bank action, we would need to take truly radical reform steps within the financial system, much more radical than we've done so far. You would need to unwind the entire structure of market-based finance that has been created since the 1970s. What we discovered in 2008 was that in that market-based system, investment bank balance sheets were very fragile. We eliminated investment banks. We absorbed the investment banks into big banks, and then we regulated them much more toughly. And we didn't see a banking crisis in 2020. What we discovered was, in a sense, even more alarming, which is that the treasury market itself could be destabilized. And that needed a backstop, and that was the central bank. So the question is, do we go forward by means of radical reform? Question mark. Might be desirable. A certain politics would demand it. The question is it realistic as a proposition? If it is not realistic as a proposition, then we go forward with ever more massive, ever more nimble, ever more strong ad hoc measures. It's a difference between, if you like, I was thinking Olympics over the summer, like the equipoise of an 8 rowing, right? 8 rowers, they have to be in perfect synchronicity and you sit absolutely flat. And that is the image of sustainability, normality. And then whitewater kayaking down a torrent of water that's running so fast, and you need huge power to stabilize, and it's a matter of lightning quick reactions. And if you ask this question about sustainability, you're, to me, asking the image of the rowing boat. Could we get capitalism to be like that? Not in our experience of real existing capitalism. Real existing capitalism looks like the whitewater kayaking. And for that, you need lightning quick reactions and massive strength to be able to counteract.
And what about fiscal activism? Deficit and debt are growing unbounded. It is not clear that this increase in public spendings is strengthening welfare states, like those that were built after the Second World War, especially in Europe. On the other hand, sooner or later, the pressure for austerity will return. What's your vision about that?
Well, this is where it gets serious. Clearly in this image of us maneuvering our canoe down the torrents in Latin America or North America, or wherever in the Alps, the Pyrenees, we need every tool that we've got. So we cannot afford to be puritanical about fiscal policy any more than we can afford to be puritanical about monetary policy. And you're right in a sense that this isn't the welfare state of old. A lot of this is ad hoc, emergency driven. It's not long term. But think about the alternatives. And credit where credit is due, certain elements of the European welfare state have been significantly updated, and the short-time working system, take it from me, speaking to you from the United States, where we don't even have proper unemployment insurance, the European experiment with short-time working was a great success. Yes, this has consequences for the government balance sheet. Is there any indication, the slightest scintilla or hint of an indication that the scale of those balance sheets, changed as it is causing anyone any problem right now? Where would you see that? You would see that in the bond market, and you would see that in yields. Right now, Italy, Spain, and Greece can borrow at better yields than the United States. If Europe chooses to turn this into an issue, to turn the return of fiscal rules, Stability and Growth Pact, Maastricht criteria into an issue in 2022, we should call it what it is. It is an explicitly political choice. It is not forced. It is not forced by the economic or financial circumstances. Conservatives may want to do this. You can't deny them this in a democracy, but we should recognize what it is. It is not a demand of sustainability. It is not something we have to do. It is their political choice. And given that 60% of the Eurozone's population and voters live in states where the debt to GDP ratio is over 100%, to my mind, that kind of conservative vision poses a fundamental threat to democratic sovereignty in the euro area and should be resisted. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a conversation about how we make this work and whether we are okay with becoming Japan, which is the nightmarish scenario that you'd be heading towards. Right now, I think Eurozone GDP overall, debt to GDP is just short of 100%, I think, if I have the figure right in my head. So we're a long way away from Japan. And Italy, big worst case country, over 150%, a long way from Japan. So this is manageable, but there is every reason to have a long run conversation about what this vision is going to be, but it should not be under the mandate from heaven that says globalization says, sustainability says, we have to have this conversation, we have to have it urgently, and people should be expected to pay an exorbitant price to meet some formal criterion that we once upon a time agreed at Maastricht in the early 1990s. Like, that is a fetish. And we know you can make politics out of fetishes, but we should be clear about what's happening when people are pursuing that kind of policy.
The initial response to the pandemic was hesitant in most of the world, well, especially in Europe and America. Maybe China or South Korea succeeded containing the pandemic, but you remark in your book some examples. For instance, here in Spain, some demonstrations of Women's Day or Champions League matches were authorized in the first days of March, and while Italy had already started the confinements. It wasn't the only example, of course, among Western countries, but had we underestimated systematically the risks that came from nature and are related to our way of life?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what February and March reveal is a fundamental cognitive disconnect between a global elite, a political elite that lives globally, that travels around the world. These G20 meetings take place all over the world. If you're in that kind of set, you're constantly in airports, you're traveling around the world. And yet at that moment, COVID was something that was happening in a faraway city called Wuhan, in a Chinese province called Hubei. And then the Chinese were doing exotic and authoritarian things that China does. And it wasn't our problem. And that is the misapprehension. In the book doesn't indulge in the sort of Olympics of governance that have preoccupied everyone since the failures. It assumes basically that everyone failed. That in a sense, almost the success stories are not really worth talking about because they're so unusual. And I think analysts think that in large part, South Korea just got lucky. It got lucky in the sense that it had the MERS experience in 2015, so it knew how serious this was. And then secondly, the outbreak was early and it was small and they got to it quickly. And with an exponential process like this, how you deal with it at its beginnings, which may be to a degree a matter of luck because it's so small, totally determines your outcome later on, because once you're further along the exponential curve, all of your choices are terrible and you're going to look as though you failed whatever you do. You're either going to absorb a huge exorbitant cost economically, or millions of people are going to die. And we've ended up with both. 10 plus million excess deaths, according to The Economist, and an unprecedented shock to the global economy. So yes, this reflects our continuing inability to grasp what this involves. And my fear is that even now, we still don't, even as it is continuing, even as we know what the risks are, even as new variants have emerged which are continuing to disrupt our lives, we are still not focused on this problem, right? Where are the hundreds of billions you would expect the EU to be spending on pandemics now? They're not. They're spending it on digital and climate, which are great causes, but we should also surely have a huge biotech program. We don't. We have a small biotech program. There is a biotech program. There's this new health program for the EU, but the dimensions are orders of magnitude different. And we know it's not just the cliche, none of us is safe until we're all safe. And we do not have the supercharged, high urgency daily reporting on global vaccination rates that you would anticipate. I want to know how many people are being vaccinated in Brazil, in Peru, every single day, because I know perfectly well that my chances of being able to book a summer holiday next year, or my daughter being able to complete her studies normally, may depend on that. And it's, to me, just fundamental. I mean, as an analyst, I'm really struggling to understand now, not about February and March, but now, why this doesn't have the urgency that you would expect.
And speaking about the European Union, it shows the best example of different responses to economic crisis in 2008 and 2020. The obsession with austerity had disappeared for the moment, and for the first time, some kind of mutual bonds are being used to finance recovery plans. Is this the beginning of a promising path for European unity?
It could be. It should be. I'm sure many people on this call think so. The Spanish government played a serious and patient role in getting us there. And you put up with nonsense, and you should never have been subject to. I have a few rather nasty lines about the Austrians and the Dutch, who should take a long, hard look at themselves. So yes, it could be. But I think the point to emphasize is this is down to politics. Anyone who said that democracy, was sort of faded and we were in a post-political period should have a look at the Eurozone right here, right now. Because not just who wins the German election, but how the seats in the ensuing German government are distributed. The micro-politics of coalitions will exercise a pivotal influence on where Europe goes from here. Because we've already had the 8 small austerity countries already mount their austerity agenda. They've said that the default is Maastricht if we can't agree on anything else, which is a catastrophe. And Germany has so far not aligned, and that is crucial. And who holds the German finance ministry will, to a large extent, determine where Berlin pivots. And that depends on the voters at the end of this month. And so all of Europe needs to be focused on that. The comparison with 2008 could either be reassuring in the sense that we avoided the disasters of that moment, or it could say we aren't there yet, right? Because if the crisis was in 2008 and the Greek revelations were in the fall of 2009, that's where we are now. The austerity push began in 2010, and the crisis was not finally contained even in its broad outline until 2012. So that puts us on the timeline. This book is written into that deliberately, in the sense that 2022 is the moment of truth. And that'll be the moment where we discover how much Europe has actually learned. 2 different levels matter here: the fiscal policy side, which will be the hot political potato, and the ECB. And frankly, I hope that no one says anything about the ECB. Like, if the ECB just goes on doing what it's doing, we can all be happy. The fear must be that will be politicized too, on the same grounds. That, in other words, they should suspend their emergency bond buying. And as soon as they suspend their emergency bond buying, Greece goes into crisis. Because Greece's debt to GDP is currently at 210% of GDP, and Italy is very borderline.
Okay, and let's talk about China. A pandemic that started there has not slowed down the rise of the country as a great world power. Rather the contrary. You predict that its economy will surpass the US even sooner than expected, possibly by the end of this decade. What consequences could that have?
So yes, absolutely. I mean, Spain being a football country, let's use a Spain analogy. It's as though in the first half, the Chinese took 2 goals, and then the whistle goes, we go out to the second half, and the other team just runs down to its own goal and spends 45 minutes firing the ball into its own net. And at 90 minutes, the referee blows the whistle and goes, I think you won. Right? I mean, they lost the first half. If you stop the clock at the end of February, this is the worst shot to the Chinese regime in its history to date. It is a huge blow to its legitimacy. The Chinese regime does not respect the individual rights of its citizens, but in the sense we understand it. But it does respect their need for security, and it had failed to deliver security. This is absolutely fundamental, and especially on health. Public health is fundamental to the legitimacy of the communist regime, because China's history marks it as a place of pandemics. And so not to be a place of pandemics is crucial for what it means to be modern and Chinese. They fail. And the economic damage to China in February is huge. Not as large as it becomes elsewhere, but very severe, because we have to remember that bits of China's economy are rich and prosperous and modern and export-orientated and global. But 600 million Chinese live on levels of income which anywhere else in the world would count as poor. And indeed, there was a political argument within the Chinese leadership about this that was repressed because it was so embarrassing. So it's really our failure that hands them a victory. And on the back of that, yes, I think you do see Beijing energized. And the trace of this is Hong Kong. They move aggressively on Hong Kong. The trace of this would be the move against Jack Ma and the oligarchs. This is the Xi Jinping regime flexing its muscles. They fight a little battle with India in the Himalayas. China is powerful, and it's not pulling back, and it's moving forward rapidly. They conclude the biggest trade deal in the world, the East Asian Trade Partnership, which they're the anchor of. Yes. So you could, I think, say China won, if you like. But I think the more fundamental point to make is that the real question out of 2020 into 2021, and it's more serious by the day, is whether we're even playing that game anymore. Because the game in which China wins is a game in which status is measured in terms of economics. It's measured in terms of GDP. And as China's GDP rises, as its trade rises, as its level of general modernization rises, it becomes more and more heavy and more powerful in the world because it's so large and so sophisticated. But what America made clear in 2020 is that it doesn't want to play that game. What America has announced, the hard power game that America has announced, is it is serious about great power competition. And in that rivalry, the Americans will stop at nothing. And what they will target is not Huawei selling phones to America or Huawei selling phones to Spain, but Huawei itself, its entire technological infrastructure. And they have gone down the supply chain to its root in the Dutch firms that make the incredibly sophisticated, unique machines which are crucial to chip fabrication, and they are cutting off that entire tech supply chain to China. And that is not first and foremost a hit against GDP, though it may be that, but it's fundamentally a hit against sovereignty. What the Americans are saying is, we will define the technological level to which you will be allowed to develop. And China can't accept that, and Beijing won't accept that. So this is a program for conflict.
And we need to collaborate with China because there's no solution to climate change without them.
They are the problem. It's not so much there's no solution, it's like entirely up to them whether there is a solution. They account for 28% of global emissions. That's more than the entire OECD, the United States, Europe, everyone put together. Japan is China. They have grown those emissions spectacularly in 20 years. They've completely changed economic history as we know it, and with it, the environmental balance. And they are still growing. And they were until very recently, at least, the largest funder of fossil fuel development in most emerging markets as well. So, and they have to make the hard choices because they are coal, right? I mean, that entire energy system is fundamentally based around coal. They are also, however, leaders in renewables. So yes, it's difficult to just, we often talk about this problem as though somehow China is making concessions to us because we're the people who really care about climate, and then they come along. It's the other way around. Like, what we do and whether it matters one way or the other entirely determined by them. And they need to do it too, because climate crisis for them is so much more severe than it is for us in Western Europe or North America. I mean, for them, it's life and death, as it is for India. I mean, they will suffer drought, starvation, the whole works, unless they can stabilize.
And today, public opinion is more sensitive to environmental risks, and the Paris Agreement has gotten back on track after being sabotaged by Trump. Europe insists on an ecological transformation due to the funds mobilized. Are we better prepared to respond to the climate crisis after the pandemic crisis?
I don't think the pandemic distracted us from the climate crisis in the way that some people feared. As I've said, I don't think we're sufficiently focused on the pandemic crisis still. I think the EU's moves on climate are substantial and important and innovative. The jury is out. The question still hangs in the air whether they're large enough or fast enough, significant enough, in other words, or whether this is a kind of Potemkin village. You know, it looks good. It has the outlines of the sort of program we need, but it isn't actually the program that we need. And to that extent, it's deceptive. And I think that is the question, and it will be decided in nitty-gritty negotiations, tough inside bargaining over, you know, questions like gas, and the current spike in gas prices is already producing like a backlash. It'll be argued over in, you know, debates about the future of diesel cars, where the Germans will suddenly flip fronts, and far from being a green country, they will be in fact the defender of the status quo. I mean, it's going to be a very tough and enduring battle. And again, politics, right? We need coalitions, powerful and sustainable coalitions of democratic governance to sustain this, because that's the only way we're going to be able to get it done. So I'm positive in the sense that we didn't move backwards, but I'm not sure that we're moving fast enough in the right direction.
And America's hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan has been a serious blow to its prestige and that of the entire West. Many voices fear that the current scenario benefits authoritarian regimes such as China, Russia, or Iran. Do you agree?
Not in a simple way. I did a piece in the New Statesman trying to interpret the Afghanistan situation, which obviously happened months after I'd finished the book, but was prefigured by what was happening before. And I think there are two elements that are worth highlighting for our listeners today. The first is that Biden's decision to go ahead with the Afghanistan withdrawal, to my mind, has got to be placed against the backdrop of what we've now learned about the breakdown in the command chain at the height of power in the United States. General Milley, as Joint Chiefs of Staff, clearly was involved in efforts to cut the president out of the decision-making loop on nuclear weapons. And we know that they were also resisting the president's demand that they mount some kind of martial law. And we also know that they resisted Trump's demand, and this is the link to Afghanistan, to accelerate the pullout out of Afghanistan. The American military decided that part of Trump's craziness, he had ended support for allies in Syria, and now he was going to do the same in Afghanistan. And Milley was part of the military command chain that was trying to resist this. And quite apart from President Biden's personal, I think, preference to pull out of Afghanistan, which he has signaled for years, I think slowing down Trump's agreement, and it was a bad agreement by any measure, and it sacrificed our Afghan allies, it's quite clear. But inside Washington, it would have looked like a surrender to Milley, who actually was trying to stop this too. So in one way, I think it's quite healthy, frankly, that in the US, the president, the elected president, who had a hard time getting his election acknowledged, is at least now imposing himself on the soldiers who didn't want to pull out of Afghanistan. And instead, they issued, and I don't say this with dark humor, but as a matter of fact, that the veterans organizations were handing out suicide prevention hotline numbers to America's soldiers. This is the sort of thing which in the history of Europe has produced coups, and that is not what we have seen in the United States now. But that is the kind of level of disarticulation that we're seeing. All the while, and this is the second point that you really have, I think, to put in perspective with regard to Afghanistan, Biden authorized a defense budget of $755 billion. And what is that going on? That's going on high tech. That's going on the wars of the future. That's going on the confrontation with China. Now, America is famously spends money on weapons. The weapons aren't very good. All of that is clearly true. But if you're asking yourself, is America pulling back from the world? Look at the strategy, look at the spending figures, look at the technological projects. It does not look like that at all. Do they know yet how they are going to position themselves? No, no one does. I mean, this is an inherently, fundamentally difficult problem. Are they going to end all boots on the ground counterinsurgency activity? Clearly not. I mean, they're still going to use drones and special forces like they do against ISIS in Syria and Iraq practically every day of the week, right? So they are in a process of reflection. But nothing about their stance right now suggests withdrawal. And just look at the deal they've just tied up with Australia and Britain on nuclear submarines. That is forward, or on submarines rather, not nuclear, but that is forward footing. That is an aggressive weapon. This is a forward positioning of naval force of allies in the Pacific region. So that is the tilt in American policy. And the severity and the seriousness, we've not really talked about this so far, of the American crisis in political terms is reflected in the fact that these issues of command chain, as exotic, as sort of almost orientalizing as they may appear, because this does remind one of Spanish history at other points or Portuguese history at other moments. Like, that is a real issue in the United States right now. Who actually controls, who actually has the levers of power? We used to talk about this in times of the deep state. That was this paranoid language of the Trump people. But the more we know, the more clear it becomes, in a sense, that disarticulation, the breaking down of the coherence of government, is one of the crucial developments of last year in the US. And Afghanistan, if it has one good thing about it, it's a reassertion of civilian control over decision-making.
And I think you're worried about the toxic political atmosphere in US politics. You explain how, after decades of political pressure against a strong central government, the United States lacks the instruments of other nations for decisive action. What can we expect from the Biden administration?
Well, they are trying to remedy the issue, but they are acting from within the problem. You're trying to fix a system which is broken from within the system that is broken. And that means that they run into continuous opposition and huge difficulties. And when they make an advance on one front, they're counted on another. There is a struggle going on within the structure of the American state. And the American state is famously multifaceted. You have the division of powers between the executive branch and Congress. You have the courts, the Supreme Court, which the Republicans have packed with their people. And then you have states like Texas, for instance, which can pass, barbarously regressive legislation on abortion, and then have the Supreme Court, thumbs up, it's all fine. So it's a dangerous situation. The crisis revealed how incapacitating it can be. Right now, today, in the United States, there are several states where the hospitals are on the point of failing, and there's very little that Washington can do. And when we say the states, they're the size of European countries, right? They're the size of Spain or in Italy, let alone Portugal. So these are very serious governance issues which are being played out inside the US, and the victory that Biden won and the Democrats won was simply too narrow. It's too small for them to be able to bulldoze anything through. And as soon as they do try to bulldoze, say the $3.5 trillion package for infrastructure. And we have to say, this is like elementary provision of childcare, child benefits of a type that all Europeans take for granted, or rudimentary spending on railway systems, which again, Europeans take for granted, or taking electricity and putting it in the ground rather than having it on poles, which are literally pieces of timber with the wires strung up, which is why power goes out in the United States as much as it does in the rural areas. They face huge opposition from within their own party, from the Senate, which will try and cap the debt limit, and ultimately from the courts, which may challenge this. So it is a deep battle going on. It's analogous in that sense to the constitutional issues that Spain might face over something like Catalonia, right? It's that kind of a deep fissure within the state, which has huge and complex history that goes back centuries, and is very difficult to easily resolve. In the American case, we should be clear that the key fault line here is race, which was, of course, exposed very graphically with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. But a key element of all of this is white minority power, which is something that the Republicans in certain parts of the US are just dedicated to upholding. They are no longer committed to upholding regularly the outcome of electoral processes.
So I think that our societies, Western societies, are more divided now than before the pandemic. Yeah. So is it true or not that we will emerge better from the pandemic?
No, this was a huge wound. I mean, it's as simple as that. There's no pretending. I mean, we did respond in various ways, which were quite creative. Politics didn't entirely fail, which is a relief, because it looked, as we were saying, in March and April, like European politics would fail. It didn't. We came through the constitutional crisis in the United States, which is a relief. But the hurt suffered by millions of people, the loss of life, is huge. It's a vast shock. And even the success story, the vaccine success story, which is a triumph of the human spirit of a global scale, right? We were able to do the vaccines because Chinese researchers committed all of their resources to sequencing the genetic code and then took personal political risks to put it online. And that triggered researchers all over the world, in pursuit of this. It's a heroic and marvelous story that we should all celebrate. And are we committed to amping that up to the absolute max, to building palaces to molecular biology and saying, we need this, thank you so much, we want more, can you do other things too? No, we're not. We're penny pinching, and we have not managed to deliver those life-saving and safety-providing vaccines to half the world's population, even though we know we'd be better off. So no. I mean, it's a serious shock that we suffered. We've come through it better than we perhaps had reason to expect us to, but the real worry is there's more to come and we're not done.
So Adam, thank you very much. I've enjoyed a lot reading your book. I think it's very clarifying, and thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to Critica, thanks to Fundación Rafael del Pino. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.